A sweltering summer morning in downtown Atlanta. The sun had yet to reach its peak, but the heat already radiated from the asphalt streets and towering buildings. Peachtree Street was bustling, blaring taxi horns, the occasional wail of police sirens, and a constant flow of pedestrians navigating the chaos. Among the traffic, a white and blue patrol car crept through the congestion, its driver gripping the wheel with a practiced ease. Officer Haram, 29 years old, ambitious, confident, and undeniably arrogant, enjoyed the power that came with his uniform. To him, law enforcement wasn't just about protection. It was about control, about asserting dominance in a world he believed needed order. Beside him sat Officer Ray Green, his older, more measured partner. Ray had seen Haram's cocky attitude in action many times before. The younger officer was good at his job, but his arrogance often pushed him toward the edge of reckless judgment. As they waited at a red light near the Fulton County Courthouse, Haram's gaze wandered to the sidewalk. An elderly black woman, dressed in a light blue floral dress, was crossing the street at an unhurried pace. She carried herself with quiet dignity, unfazed by the impatience of the world around her. Haram smirked, muttering just loud enough for Ray to hear. "Look at that old lady, probably the type to walk slow and then complain when someone calls her out for it." Ray cast him a disapproving glance, but said nothing. He had learned that some lessons in humility could only be taught the hard way. The light turned green, and they moved on. As they pulled into the courthouse parking lot, Ray caught sight of the woman again, this time entering the grand entrance of the building. Something about her composure made him take a second look, but he dismissed the thought and followed Haram inside. The courthouse was thick with tension. Several high-profile cases were on the docket that morning, drawing crowds of lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and family members. The floral-dressed woman made her way through the halls, her expression calm yet commanding. Meanwhile, Haram and Ray had arrived for a routine testimony, a minor drug possession case that Haram had handled the previous week. It was just another day of standard procedure for him. What he didn't realize was that another case, far more significant, was about to unfold in that very courtroom. As a theft trial concluded, the courtroom clerk called for the next case, a matter that, apparently, had drawn federal attention. Murmurs rippled through the audience as people exchanged puzzled glances. No one had expected a federal intervention. Then, the woman in the floral dress stepped forward. She nodded at the judge before speaking with quiet authority. "I am Alice Hathaway, Senior Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A stunned silence settled over the room. Every eye was locked onto her. Haram, who stood near the witness stand, felt his stomach drop. His pulse quickened as realization crashed down on him. The woman he had mocked just minutes ago, the one he had dismissed as an insignificant pedestrian, was, in fact, one of the most powerful figures in the FBI. Ray slowly turned to Haram, his expression unreadable, but his eyes saying everything. "You just made a huge mistake." Alice Hathaway remained poised as she addressed the court, explaining the FBI's involvement in an ongoing investigation. But midway through her statement, her gaze briefly flickered toward Haram, just for a second. It was a passing glance, subtle yet piercing, one that sent an icy chill through his spine. And in that fleeting moment, Haram understood something profound. Some lessons in life are unavoidable, and today he had just learned his. The courtroom remained thick with silence as the name Alice Hathaway echoed through the chambers. The senior director of the FBI, the same woman Haram had scoffed at just hours earlier, now stood at the center of attention, her composed yet commanding presence dominating the room. Haram's pulse pounded in his ears. A wave of shame began creeping through his chest. tightening like an unseen hand. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself, but the memory of his careless mockery lingered in his mind like an embarrassing stain. Alice Hathaway strode toward the witness stand with the measured grace of someone who belonged in rooms of power. Behind her, several FBI agents remained still, their silence speaking volumes. This was no ordinary case. Sitting further back in the gallery, Haram felt his palms grow damp. He had never felt smaller in his life. Ray, ever observant, cast him a sidelong glance that seemed to say, "Do you even realize who you just disrespected?" The judge took a moment before speaking, his expression betraying a flicker of surprise at Alice's unexpected presence. "Director Hathaway," he addressed her, keeping his tone professional. "I was not informed of your appearance in today's proceedings." Alice offered a calm smile, unruffled. "Your Honor, I am here as an observer on behalf of the FBI, but I am also here to present evidence directly related to this case." A ripple of intrigue spread through the room. Lawyers exchanged whispers, defendants fidgeted nervously, and Haram felt the atmosphere grow heavier with each passing second. Alice flipped open a dossier on the stand, her voice steady as she continued. "The Bureau has been monitoring the activities of a large-scale financial crime syndicate, one that extends from shell corporations to influential figures within local governance. Several individuals have been under federal surveillance for months. Today, the FBI is prepared to present evidence that the case being tried here is not just an isolated fraud incident, but part of a broader, organized criminal operation." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor, who had anticipated a straightforward trial, now found himself scrambling to comprehend the scale of what was unfolding. "Director Hathaway," he said hesitantly, "are you saying the defendants in this case are linked to a larger criminal network?" Alice nodded. "Not only that, but we have reason to believe there has been collusion at the municipal level." Haram felt the blood drain from his face. Financial crime, corruption, and city officials. The case had suddenly grown far beyond his initial understanding. Yet, what unsettled him more than anything was Alice Hathaway herself. Despite wielding immense power, she showed no arrogance. She did not raise her voice, nor did she attempt to intimidate with authority. She simply laid out the facts, allowing the truth to speak for itself. That, Haram realized, was something he had never encountered before, an individual whose respect was not demanded, but naturally commanded. As lawyers and prosecutors debated the implications of the new revelations, Haram sat in silence, his mind spiraling. He thought about his attitude earlier that morning, how quickly he had judged this woman based on nothing but appearance and assumptions. He thought about all the other times he had done the same, labeling people by their race, age, or perceived status. And now, his own biases had made a fool of him. Ray, sensing his thoughts, smirked slightly. "Told you, Haram. Never judge a book by its cover." Haram exhaled slowly, not bothering to reply. Regardless of how this trial would end, one thing was certain. His encounter with Alice Hathaway had changed him forever. Haram sat motionless in his chair, his mind still reeling from what had just unfolded. Mere hours ago, he had scoffed at Alice Hathaway, dismissing her as an unremarkable old woman. But now, she stood before a packed courtroom, calmly exposing a case so vast it could shake the entire city. Beside him, Ray nudged his arm, his voice low. "You good?" Haram swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on Alice as she stepped down from the witness stand and returned to her seat among the FBI agents. The entire courtroom remained heavy with silence, as if everyone was still processing the gravity of what had been revealed. What started as a financial fraud case was now linked to organized crime and possibly even city officials. That meant the very people entrusted to uphold justice, local authorities, maybe even some of Haram's own colleagues, were complicit in a corrupt power game. And what about him? A lump formed in Haram's throat. He had spent his career reveling in the authority his badge gave him. He enjoyed being the one in control, the one who could command respect or fear. But now, for the first time, he saw a different kind of power. Alice Hathaway didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to intimidate or force obedience. And yet, the entire courtroom had hung on her every word. That was real power. Power that came from integrity. The trial continued with other cases, but Haram was no longer mentally present. His thoughts drifted to the way he had carried himself all these years. He recalled the times he had mocked those he deemed weak, the people arrested for petty offenses, the ones who had no power to push back against the authority he wielded so easily. He had become the kind of officer he once despised as a kid. "This won't stop here," Ray muttered, breaking Haram's trance. "You think the FBI's gonna dig deeper?" Haram exhaled slowly. "If Hathaway is right, then this isn't just one case, it's an entire system, and I'd bet anything she won't stop until she gets to the bottom of it." Ray smirked. "Good for the city, bad for the ones involved." Haram didn't respond. His thoughts were fixated on something more personal. Alice Hathaway had seen him. She knew his name, and she knew exactly how he had treated her that morning. Would she remember? Did she already view him as part of the problem? The thought unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. As the courtroom adjourned, Haram stood, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. Ray watched him closely. "You gonna talk to her?" Ray asked. Haram glanced at Alice, who was engaged in discussion with several FBI agents near the exit. A part of him wanted to step forward, to say something, maybe an apology, or at least an acknowledgement of his disrespect earlier that morning. But he hesitated. Alice Hathaway didn't need his apology. She had far more important matters to handle, and if he truly wanted to make things right, words wouldn't mean anything. Actions would. Haram sighed, then turned away. He wouldn't apologize. He would prove he could be better. Haram and Ray stepped out of the courthouse, the overcast sky mirroring the tension still hanging in the air. The press conference had just ended, and reporters were swarming to capture every detail of the explosive case. Alice Hathaway had already left with her team of FBI agents, leaving behind a strange silence in Haram's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just missed something important. Ray walked beside him, hands stuffed into his coat pockets. "Well, we just witnessed history today." Haram nodded, but his mind was racing with different thoughts. He couldn't forget the way Alice had looked at him in the courtroom. Not with anger, not with disdain, but with quiet observation, as if she had been assessing him, but assessing him for what? He had never cared much about what others thought of him before. Yet this time, the weight of it clung to him in a way he couldn't quite explain. As they reached the parking lot, Haram spotted one of the FBI agents standing nearby, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, Special Agent Stephen Mills, the man who had accompanied Alice into the courthouse that morning. Without thinking too much, Haram made his way over. "Agent Mills," he called. Mills turned, his sharp eyes scanning Haram, though there was no hostility in them. "Officer Haram, something you need?" Haram hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. "I want to know more about this case. How can I help?" Mills narrowed his eyes slightly, as if trying to decipher Haram's true intentions. "Help? I don't think your department has jurisdiction over this." "Maybe not officially," Haram admitted, "but I know this city. I know how it works, who might be involved. If you're looking for people who helped Kincaid launder money, I might have a few leads." Mills remained silent for a few seconds, then nodded. All right, but if you want to help, remember this. This isn't about power plays. This is about justice. If you're only in this for your ego, walk away now. Haram stiffened at the blunt warning. But he didn't argue, because for the first time in years, he wasn't doing this for himself. Understood, he said firmly. Mills gave a curt nod. Then be at the FBI office at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Let's see what you've got. As Haram turned back toward Ray, he could feel his partner's eyes on him, filled with curiosity. What the hell just happened? Ray raised an eyebrow. I just got invited to assist in the investigation. Haram's voice was dry, as if he still couldn't quite believe it himself. Ray blinked. You volunteered to work with the FBI? The same guy who, just this morning, was cracking jokes about a senior agent in the middle of the street? Haram exhaled, glancing up at the cloudy sky. I think it's time for a change. Ray was quiet for a moment before smirking. Huh? Maybe you finally grew a brain. Haram chuckled, but deep down, he knew this wasn't about being smart or not. This was about doing the right thing, and for the first time in his life, he actually wanted to see what that felt like. The next morning, Haram arrived at the FBI headquarters precisely on time. The building carried a cold, authoritative air, vastly different from the cluttered, paperwork-laden offices of the police station he was accustomed to. Agents in dark suits moved efficiently through the halls, each with a clear purpose, wasting no time. At the reception desk, he presented his police badge and was directed to a conference room on the upper floor. As he pushed open the door, he immediately spotted Special Agent Mills seated at the table, flipping through a thick case file. But what truly caught Haram off guard was the presence of Alice Hathaway. She sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable as she observed him entering. Officer Haram, Mills greeted, gesturing to the seat across from him. Have a seat. Haram sat down, keeping his composure despite the intense scrutiny he felt from both of them. Alice remained silent, arms crossed, her gaze unwavering as if she were dissecting every micro-expression on his face. You mentioned yesterday that you had leads? Mills began, his tone even but probing. Haram nodded, pulling a folded sheet of notes from his pocket. I've worked around people connected to Kincaid. There's no way he ran a money laundering operation of this scale without inside help. I have a few names, permit officials, bank employees, even some officers within my own department. Mills scanned the list. Alice didn't react, but her eyes flicked over the names swiftly, committing them to memory. Where did you get this information? Mills asked. Haram leaned back slightly. I've been on patrol for nearly a decade. Things like this don't happen without rumors circulating. I've heard these names in casual conversations between officers and local businessmen. There are certain restaurants and bars where they regularly meet to discuss business. If you keep a close watch, I'm willing to bet you'll find something. Mills nodded. Good, but I hope you understand this won't be easy. If the people on this list are really involved, then we're not the only ones watching them. They're watching us too. Are you prepared to go deeper into this investigation, Haram? Haram took a deep breath. This was the moment of decision. A part of him wanted to say no, to turn back to his old life where he only dealt with petty crimes and didn't have to worry about crossing powerful people. But another part, a part he had never listened to before, told him this was his chance to do something that truly mattered. He met Mills' gaze. I'm ready. Alice finally spoke, her voice calm yet weighty. Are you certain, Officer Haram? Because once you step into this, there's no turning back. Haram swallowed but didn't waver. I'm certain. She studied him for a long moment before giving a single nod. Good. Mills slid a thick case file across the table. These are the individuals we've been tracking. Some of them match your list. You'll be assisting us with surveillance, and if the case progresses, we may need you to go undercover. Haram flipped open the file, scanning through the faces. Some of them made his stomach tighten. Not just businessmen or officials, but people capable of ruthless actions if they felt threatened. He glanced up at Alice. "Where do I start?" She replied evenly, "By learning who to trust." At the time, Haram didn't fully grasp what she meant, but he knew he was stepping into a world unlike anything he had encountered before, a world where justice wasn't just about making arrests, but uncovering the truth buried beneath layers of deception. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to find that truth. That night, Haram sat in his patrol car, parked outside a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city. The neon signs flickered against the wet pavement, casting eerie reflections of red and blue on the asphalt. Beside him, Ray sat in silence, eyes scanning the bar's entrance through the windshield. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Ray asked, his tone hovering between concern and curiosity. Haram didn't answer immediately. He knew what Ray meant. Once he stepped into Kincaid's world, there was no easy way out. But he also knew that if he turned away now, he would forever be the kind of cop he despised, one who only scratched the surface and never dug deep enough to root out real corruption. Taking a deep breath, he finally said, "I've made my decision, Ray. If we don't do this, who will?" Ray sighed but nodded. "All right, so what's your approach?" Haram checked his watch. Midnight was approaching, the prime time for shady deals. He adjusted his jacket, ensured his sidearm was secure, and then reached for the door handle. "Just keep an eye on things," he told Ray before stepping out and heading toward the bar. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the stale scent of whiskey. A low, scratchy jazz tune played from an old speaker, mixing with the guttural laughter of drunk patrons. Haram took a slow scan of the room, searching for a familiar face, and then he saw him, George Willoughby. George was a well-connected middleman, the type who paved the way for bigger deals. If Haram could gain his trust, he could get one step closer to Kincaid. Sliding onto a bar stool, Haram ordered a whiskey and casually leaned toward George. The man barely glanced at him before smirking. "Officer Haram," George drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't expect to see you here." Haram lifted his glass, returning a faint smirk. "Not everyone wants to stay a nobody forever, George. I hear you're the kind of guy who opens doors." George raised an eyebrow, then let out a chuckle. "Interesting. And why should I trust you?" Haram leaned in, lowering his voice. "Because I'm done playing by the rules. The system is broken. If there's a way to make something for myself, I want in." George studied him for a long moment, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Maybe I'll test you," he finally said, his tone laced with hidden meaning. "But you know the rules. We don't give second chances." Haram nodded, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down his back. He had just stepped deeper into the shadows. There was no turning back. The real mission begins. The next morning, Haram reported to Mills and Alice at FBI headquarters. When he entered the briefing room, Alice was already seated at the head of the table, a file resting beneath her fingers. "You made contact with George," Mills stated rather than asked. Haram nodded. "He wants to test me. I need a solid cover story." Alice studied him for a moment before nodding. "We'll set you up with a full alias, but remember, if they suspect you, we won't be able to pull you out in time." Haram knew the risks. He wasn't expecting a safety net. This was a gamble, and he had already placed his bet. Alice slid a folder toward him. "This is your new identity, a disgraced cop. kicked off the force for corruption, now working as a freelancer in underground dealings. We've planted false records and transactions to support the story. Haram flipped through the pages, reading the details of his fabricated past. The documents were disturbingly convincing. If he didn't know better, he'd believe them himself. Mills folded his arms. "Are you still sure about this?" Haram let out a breath, forcing a small smirk despite the weight settling in his chest. "I don't think I have a choice anymore." Alice nodded. "Then let's begin." Haram left FBI headquarters, feeling the full weight of his decision. He was diving headfirst into dangerous territory, knowing full well that if he failed, he wouldn't just be burned, he'd be buried. But if he succeeded, he wouldn't just take down Kincaid. He might just change the very system he once loathed. For the first time in his life, Haram was fighting for something bigger than himself. And though the road ahead was treacherous, he knew there was no turning back. The Atlanta night was pitch black. No moon, no stars, only the flickering neon lights reflecting off the damp streets. Haram walked slowly along the sidewalk, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. His exterior was calm, but inside a storm raged. He had just received his first task from George Willoughby, a test of loyalty. A simple job, George had said, but Haram knew nothing was ever simple when working with men like Kincaid. Ahead of him stood an old warehouse, nestled between abandoned industrial buildings. According to George's instructions, Haram had to retrieve a briefcase containing sensitive documents and deliver it to a secondary location. That was all. But his instincts screamed that this was more than just a test. Taking a deep breath, Haram approached the side door, pulling out the key George had given him. He slid it into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space, illuminated only by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Inside, the warehouse was nearly empty, except for a worn wooden table in the center. On it lay the briefcase he was looking for. He took a step forward, reaching out. A voice cut through the silence. "You're late." Haram spun around, hand instinctively moving toward the concealed gun at his waist. A man stood in the shadows, his face obscured, but his voice carried a sharp, cold edge. "George said you'd be coming for it," the man continued, stepping forward. The dim light revealed a sharp-featured face, eyes calculating. "But I have to ask, who the hell are you?" Haram kept his face neutral, though his heart pounded. "I'm the guy sent to pick up the briefcase. If you have a problem, take it up with George." The man smirked, but didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Haram like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You're new. George might trust you, but I don't." Haram clenched his jaw, keeping his voice steady. "I don't need your trust. I just need to do my job." A tense silence stretched between them before the man finally took a step back. "Then take it. But remember, we're always watching." Haram tightened his grip around the briefcase, then turned and walked out. He could feel the man's gaze drilling into his back. Even though he couldn't hear footsteps, he knew he was being followed. A dangerous choice. Haram drove through the quiet streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The briefcase sat beside him, holding documents Kincaid would protect at all costs. But the real question was, what could the FBI do with them? He turned on the radio, listening for any indication that he was being tailed. The night was silent, except for the sound of his tires rolling over the pavement. But the feeling of unease refused to fade. A few blocks from the drop-off point, Haram reached for his phone and dialed a coded number Alice had given him. After 3 rings, her familiar voice answered. "Haram? It's me," he said quickly. "I have the briefcase, but I think someone's watching me." Alice was silent for a moment before responding. Don't go to the drop-off. Follow the backup plan. Haram clenched his jaw. The backup plan meant changing course, keeping the briefcase out of enemy hands until the FBI could secure it safely. But it also meant risking suspicion from George and the rest of Kincaid's network. I understand. Hanging up, Haram made a sharp turn onto a smaller road, away from his original route. If he played this right, he could disappear unnoticed. If he didn't, he'd be walking straight into a trap. The confrontation Haram pulled into an empty parking lot, cutting the engine. Across from him sat a black SUV, FBI's vehicle, waiting in the shadows. Stepping out, he grabbed the briefcase and approached. The SUV's door opened, and Alice stepped out, her sharp eyes scanning him immediately. Everything okay? She asked. For now. He handed over the briefcase. What's inside? Alice unlatched it, flipping through the papers. It only took seconds for her expression to shift. Financial records, she murmured. If we cross-reference these with our data, we can link Kincaid to millions in illegal transactions. Haram exhaled, though he knew it was too early to relax. I need to go back. If they suspect anything, this whole operation is dead. Alice shut the briefcase, watching him carefully. You're taking a huge risk. Haram smirked slightly. Justice doesn't come easy, does it? Alice's lips curled into the smallest smile. Number? But that's why we fight for it. Haram nodded, turning away, leaving the briefcase in Alice's hands. He knew that returning to George and Kincaid's men meant facing scrutiny, suspicion, and possibly worse. But there was no other way. If he wanted to take Kincaid down, he had to keep walking deeper into the darkness, and he was ready. Truth revealed. The skies over Atlanta were heavy, a thick gray cloud cover mirroring the suffocating weight pressing down on Haram. He stood in front of the mirror in the precinct locker room, staring at his reflection. Beneath the police uniform, he was still a man with too many unanswered questions. Today, everything would change. After weeks of undercover work, he and Ray were scheduled for a high-stakes meeting with one of Kincaid's top associates, a senior city official. George Willoughby had arranged the meeting as a final test of their loyalty. If all went well, they would gain Kincaid's trust. If anything seemed off, everything would collapse in an instant. Alice had warned him the night before. You have to stay calm, Haram, she had said, her eyes sharper than ever. They will test you. They will push you into situations where there's no easy way out. But remember, you're not in this alone. Haram repeated those words in his head as he took a deep breath and stepped outside. The final move. The bar chosen for the meeting was tucked away in a shadowy corner of the old district. Its dim lighting created an atmosphere perfect for conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. Haram and Ray walked in, immediately spotting George sitting in the back with a man in a gray suit, Edward Monahan. A key player in Kincaid's network, Edward specialized in financial manipulation within the city's government. George gestured for them to sit. Haram kept his face neutral, but every sense in his body was on high alert. These are the men I told you about. George introduced them with confidence. They're reliable. Edward studied them with an expression of skepticism. How reliable? Ray smirked. We've helped clean up quite a few messes in the last few weeks. I'd say that's proof enough. Edward didn't look convinced. He pulled a thick envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. We have a special job, he said. If you're really loyal, this is your chance to prove it. Haram glanced at the envelope, then back at Edward. What kind of job? Edward leaned back in his chair, his voice smooth but carrying an underlying threat. We need some files to disappear. FBI files. Haram's heart pounded. This was it. the final test. If they accepted, they would be deeper in Kincaid's operations than ever. If they hesitated, suspicion would be immediate. He quickly exchanged a glance with Ray, who remained composed. "What kind of files?" Haram asked, buying time. Edward smirked. "Financial records tied to some of our friends. We know the FBI has them. We need someone on the inside to make sure they're gone before it's too late." Haram loosened his shoulders, pretending to weigh the offer. "If we do this," he said carefully, "we want guarantees. We don't want to be left hanging if things go south." Edward nodded approvingly. "A smart question. You'll have protection." What he didn't know was that, at that very moment, the FBI was ready to strike. The takedown before Edward could say another word, the bar doors burst open. A flood of FBI agents stormed in, weapons raised. "FBI, nobody move!" Chaos erupted. George shot up from his chair but was quickly subdued. Edward lunged to escape, but Haram was faster, slamming him down against the table. "What the hell is this?" Edward growled, struggling. Haram leaned in, voice ice cold. "I thought you said we were reliable." Within moments, the room was under control. In the corner, Alice stepped in, her expression both sharp and satisfied. She locked eyes with Haram and Ray, giving them a subtle nod. "Well done," she said. Haram released Edward as the agents cuffed him. He straightened up, taking a deep breath. It was over. A lesson in redemption. Haram's story wasn't just an undercover operation. It was a lesson in character, transformation, and integrity. He had started out as an arrogant officer who believed power was something to be wielded over others. But through his trials, and especially his encounters with Alice, a woman he had once dismissed, but later realized was one of the most powerful figures in the justice system, he learned that respect was not something to be demanded, but something to be earned through actions and morality. Alice had never needed to retaliate against his initial mockery. Instead, she let her presence, her authority, and her unwavering commitment to justice speak for themselves. And that, more than anything, had forced Haram to reflect on himself. Going undercover wasn't just about taking down criminals. It was about confronting his own prejudices, his own mistakes, and his own arrogance. He realized that true power wasn't about control or fear. It was about the ability to protect justice and do the right thing, even when no one was watching. In the end, this story reminds us that redemption is possible, that people can change, and that real growth comes from acknowledging one's flaws, making amends, and choosing to walk the path of integrity. Because if Haram could change, so could anyone. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.